Authoritarian Sociopathy, Toward a Renegade Psychological Experiment. Chapter 8. Power and Compassion Are Mutually Exclusive. Psychologist Gerben A. van Cleef from the University of Amsterdam collaborated with colleagues from UC Berkeley to conduct an experiment designed to identify how power influences someone's emotional reaction to the suffering of others. Unlike the previous experiments we've discussed, where participants were randomly selected for high-power and low-power roles, in this experiment, 118 undergraduates from diverse backgrounds filled out a questionnaire about their own sense of power in their actual lives and were identified as high-power and low-power individuals. Subjects were randomly paired off to take turns sharing stories in which they experienced great pain or emotional suffering. During the exchange, both participants were hooked up to an electrocardiogram or ECG machine to measure their automatic emotional regulation. Individuals faced with psychological stress typically exhibit increased respiratory sinus arrhythmia or RSA reactivity, resulting in a lower heart rate and a calmed, relaxed feeling. In addition, after the exchange, participants all filled out a second questionnaire describing both their own emotional experience and what they perceived of their partner's emotional experience. The results were unmistakable. For starters, increased stress readings in the storyteller correlated with increased stress readings in the low-power listener, but not in high-power listeners. In other words, low-power individuals respond to the suffering of others with emotional reciprocity, but high-power individuals experience greater emotional detachment. According to self-reporting after the experiment, high-power individuals felt less compassion than low-power listeners. This could indicate that high-power individuals' lack of compassion actually exacerbates the suffering of those around them. After the experiment, researchers inquired about whether participants would like to stay in touch with their partner. As you might expect, the low-power subjects liked the idea, but the high-power subjects did not. Now, let's speculate. In the Stanford prison experiment, we saw subjects randomly appointed as high-power individuals torture subjects randomly appointed as low-power individuals. Van Cleef's research may explain why. Once the subjects of the study were given a taste of power, they simply no longer experienced reciprocal emotions with those who were powerless. And worse, the lack of compassion of the guards would have exacerbated the suffering experienced by the prisoners. How can we apply these findings to the Milgram experiment scenario, where an authority orders a subordinate to murder a stranger? We already know that 65% of subordinates in that experiment obeyed orders that they viewed as unethical. In this case, the authority is the high-power individual, the subordinate is the low-power individual, and the stranger is the one who suffers. So, we can speculate that the authority will feel less compassion for the suffering of the victim, which would make giving the lethal order easier for him, maybe even pleasurable. But we can also reason that the authority is less likely to feel compassion for the emotional distress of the subordinate. That means that the person making the life or death decision is the one most cut off from the consequences. But here's where it gets sick. The subordinate, a low-power individual, has no such emotional detachment. As we saw in the Milgram experiment, some of the subordinates exhibited signs of extreme stress. The subordinate is stuck in the impossible position of both being conditioned to obey the authority and experiencing emotional reciprocity with the victim. Is it any wonder we see high instances of suicide and post-traumatic stress disorder among soldiers, but not among ranking officers who give them their orders?